In the later chapters of Harold Jamison's life, the world outside moved faster, louder, and far more distracted than the one he had once fought to protect. He noticed the changes, the towns growing into cities, the black and white headlines giving way to glowing screens, the slow disappearance of men who remembered what it meant to crawl into a freezing metal bomber and face the jaws of war. But Harold didn't resist the change. He simply watched quietly. He never tried to impose his past on the present. He believed, perhaps more deeply than he let on, that the point of his survival wasn't to be remembered, but to ensure others didn't have to fight the same way. And so he aged in peace as best he could. After Ruth passed away in 1986, his house became even quieter. The soft presence that had steadied his storm was gone, and though the silence wasn't new to him, it now had an edge. He began taking longer walks, though his limp slowed him. He visited the small local library weekly and sat by the window, always with the same book in hand, an old aviation history, volume with a B-17 on the cover. He never read it from start to finish. Instead, he'd open to the photos and stare at them as if he were scanning for names he knew. His routine rarely changed. Coffee at dawn, feed the cat, check the mail, and at sunset, he'd sit in the same rocking chair on the porch and watch the horizon fade into fire-colored dusk. He wasn't waiting for anything. He was simply bearing witness to the years, to the quiet, and to the lives that never came home. Veterans from later wars sometimes found their way to his porch. Word had spread over time that the old tail gunner was always willing to sit and listen, though he rarely shared much himself. A young man back from Iraq in the early 2000s once asked Harold how he dealt with the guilt. The older man didn't answer right away. He looked up, squinting into the late afternoon sun, and finally said, "I didn't, I just carried it. The weight didn't go away, I just got stronger legs." The younger vet nodded, tears catching in the corner of his eye. Harold didn't offer a hug or a pat on the back. He simply stood up slowly, walked into the house, and returned with a chipped mug full of warm coffee. They sat in silence, watching the wind move through the cornfields. Inside Harold's home, little had changed since the 1950s. The radio still worked, though it mostly played static. A calendar from 1964 hung near the back door, not out of neglect, but as a marker of time he'd never cared to reset. On the mantel sat the only photo he'd ever framed, a crew shot of iron-willed, the B-17 he had flown in, with 10 young men lined up in front, all grinning in their heavy gear. One of them crouched low with a cigarette between his lips. Harold was the third from the left. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Before Leipzig, before we knew." Each December 14th, no matter the weather, Harold walked to the small war memorial in the town square. He didn't wear his medals. He didn't wear his uniform. He simply stood beneath the flag and whispered the names of the crew, one by one. His voice didn't shake, but if anyone had been close enough to hear, they might have noticed the slight tremble in his hands. He never missed a year. As he aged, his eyesight dimmed, and arthritis settled into his spine like the cold of altitude he once knew. The VA sent nurses to check in, and his son, now in his 50s, offered to move him into town. Harold declined. "If I have to go," he said, "I'd rather it be from the porch with my boots on." He still tended to his garden, still changed the oil in his truck by feel, and still wrote letters on a manual typewriter that hadn't seen a new ribbon in 20 years. Those letters, mostly addressed to grandchildren, were short and filled with simple wisdom. Water the roots before the leaves. Be good even when no one's looking. Never take clear skies for granted. When the end came, it came gently. One morning, a neighbor found Harold in his chair, blanket over his lap, coffee cup still warm beside him, and his old crew photo resting on his chest. He looked peaceful, like a man who had finally found stillness. The town held a modest service. No cameras, no speeches. Just folded flags, misty eyes, and a brass bugle playing taps under a gray sky. The local pastor said he wasn't famous, but he was faithful. And that counts for more than most ever know. Harold Jamison was buried next to Ruth beneath a tree he had planted after the war. The roots had grown deep, and the branches stretched high, like the quiet legacy of a man who once held the sky together with grit, steel, and resolve. No monuments mark his name in history books, but in the echo of distant engines and the quiet courage of those who survive, his story still flies. Subscribe for more Wings of Valor.